The maintenance hangar at Fob Whiskey stretched like a cathedral of steel and shadow, the desert heat making the air shimmer even in the pre-dawn hours. Chief Warrant Officer Kalina, Viper, Thorne ran her brush along the Apache's hull with methodical precision, each stroke covering the scorch marks that told stories she'd rather forget. The black paint gleamed wet under the fluorescent lights, erasing evidence of yesterday's close call over the Helmand Valley. She'd been painting aircraft since before most of the ground crew were born, but today felt different. The hangar was too quiet, missing the usual chatter and clang of tools. Even Sergeant Martinez, who never shut up about his daughter's soccer games, worked in silence near the tail rotor. Something had everyone on edge. The sound of boots on concrete echoed through the space, not the casual shuffle of maintenance personnel but the sharp, measured steps of authority. Kalina didn't look up from her work, but her shoulders tensioned. She knew that walk. Everyone did. General Patricia Hawkins emerged from the shadows like a specter in digital camouflage, her 3 stars catching the harsh light. Behind her trailed a cluster of junior officers, all trying to match her pace while scribbling notes on tablets. The general's reputation preceded her everywhere. The Iron Maiden, they called her, though never to her face. She'd climbed through ranks that barely acknowledged women existed, crushing obstacles that would have ended lesser careers. Chief Warrant Officer, Hawkins called out, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made seasoned NCOs straighten their spines. "I need to speak with you." Kalina set down her brush and turned, wiping her hands on a rag that had seen better decades. "Ma'am." She offered a crisp salute, noting how the general's eyes moved from her paint-stained flight suit to the Apache behind her, then to something else entirely. The general stepped closer, squinting at the nose of the aircraft where Kalina had been working. Her expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a micro-expression that her entourage missed but Kalina caught. It was recognition, mixed with something that looked suspiciously like surprise. "Your call sign," Hawkins said slowly, reading the partially visible letters beneath the fresh paint. "Viper." The name hung in the air like cordite after a firefight. Around them, the maintenance crew had stopped their work entirely, sensing the weight of whatever was unfolding. Kalina felt her chest tighten. She'd spent years trying to keep that name buried, painted over, forgotten. But names like Viper didn't stay hidden forever. "Yes, ma'am," she replied, her voice steady despite the earthquake building in her chest. "That's my call sign." General Hawkins studied her for a long moment, and Kalina could practically hear the gears turning behind those steel-gray eyes. Finally, the general spoke again, but this time her voice carried a different tone entirely, one that made every person in that hangar lean forward without realizing it. "I know exactly who you are." The morning sun chose that moment to break through the hangar's high windows, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. The light caught the fresh paint on the Apache's hull, and for just a moment, the ghost of the call sign beneath became visible again, like a scar that refused to heal completely. Sergeant Martinez dropped his wrench. Kalina Thorne had been flying combat missions since the towers fell, back when female pilots were still fighting for every flight hour, every combat assignment, every chance to prove they belonged in the cockpit of a war machine. She'd earned her wings in a world that questioned whether women had the physical strength to handle an Apache's controls under fire, whether they possessed the mental fortitude to make split-second life-and-death decisions while rockets exploded around them. The answer, as it turned out, was written in the sky over 3 different war zones. But recognition came with a price, and Viper had paid it in blood, sweat, and nights when sleep felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. She'd flown missions that existed only in classified reports, pulled extraction ops that saved lives while destroying others, and made choices that kept her awake long after the rotors stopped spinning. The general continued studying her, and Kalina could feel the weight of history pressing down on them both. Hawkins had her own ghosts, her own battles fought in boardrooms and briefing rooms where the weapons were policies and the casualties were careers. Two women who'd clawed their way up different mountains, now standing face to face in a maintenance hangar that smelled of JP-8 fuel and possibility. "Ma'am," Kalina said carefully, "I'm just here to maintain aircraft and fly when needed. Nothing more." A ghost of a smile flickered across Hawkins' face. "Chief, I've been reading your service record since 400 this morning. Nothing more doesn't begin to cover what you've done for this country." The junior officers shifted uncomfortably, sensing undercurrents they couldn't identify. One of them, a lieutenant colonel with ribbons that suggested he'd seen his share of action, cleared his throat. "General, we have the briefing with CENTCOM in 20 minutes. Hawkins didn't break eye contact with Kalina. "Cancel it." The words fell like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock through the assembled group. Nobody canceled briefings with Central Command. Nobody except General Patricia Hawkins. "Ma'am," the lieutenant colonel asked, his voice carefully neutral. "I said cancel it." Hawkins stepped closer to the Apache, running her hand along the freshly painted hull. "We have more important matters to discuss. Clear the hangar, everyone except Chief Thorne." The order scattered the junior officers like birds before a storm. They filed out with barely concealed confusion, tablets clutched to their chests like shields. Sergeant Martinez hesitated for a moment, looking between Kalina and the general, before gathering his tools and following the exodus. Silence settled over the hangar like dust after an explosion. The two women stood on opposite sides of the Apache, the aircraft serving as both barrier and bridge between their separate worlds. "You know," Hawkins said conversationally, "there are only 12 pilots in the entire Army with your combat flight hours. Only 3 with your mission success rate." Kalina said nothing, but her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "And there's only one," the general continued, "who's been hiding her Medal of Honor recommendation under a pile of routine maintenance reports for the past 18 months. The words hit Kalina like a missile strike. Her carefully constructed world of anonymity, of blending into the background noise of military routine, crumbled in an instant. She'd thought the recommendation had been buried, lost in the bureaucratic maze that swallowed inconvenient paperwork and uncomfortable truths. "I don't know what you're talking about, ma'am." Hawkins laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Chief, I've spent 30 years learning to read between the lines of military reports. Your commanding officer in Afghanistan wrote a recommendation that made grown men cry. Then it disappeared into a filing cabinet, buried under regulations about women in combat roles that didn't officially exist yet." The general walked around the Apache's nose, closing the distance between them. But regulations change, times change, and sometimes Chief Thorne justice catches up. Kalina felt the walls closing in, but her voice remained steady. "With respect, ma'am, I never asked for justice. I asked to serve." "And serve you did." Hawkins pulled a manila folder from inside her jacket. "Kandahar Province, October 15, 2010. Operation Silent Thunder. You remember that night." The date hit Kalina like a physical blow. Of course she remembered. Some nights never let you forget them, no matter how much time passed or how much paint you used to cover the scars. "I remember losing good people that night, ma'am." "You remember saving 12 Special Operations soldiers who were pinned down by insurgent fire. You remember flying a damaged Apache through a sandstorm with one engine failing, using night vision that kept cutting out, and somehow managing to provide close air support for 3 hours straight while taking fire from multiple positions." Hawkins opened the folder, revealing pages of testimony, photographs, and military honors that should have been pinned to Kalina's chest years ago. "You remember single-handedly turning the tide of a battle that could have been a massacre. What you might not remember is that one of those 12 soldiers you saved was my son." The hangar seemed to contract around them, all the air suddenly thin and precious. Kalina stared at the general, processing information that rewrote everything she thought she knew about this moment, this conversation, this collision of past and present. Captain Marcus Hawkins, the general continued, her voice softer now but no less intense. He's a lieutenant colonel now, leading his own unit, has 2 daughters who call me Gamma Patricia and think their daddy is Superman. Kalina closed her eyes, remembering the chaos of that night, the radio calls for immediate extraction, the way her co-pilot's voice had cracked with exhaustion as they pushed their Apache beyond its limits. She remembered faces glimpsed through infrared, soldiers running between cover while she and her weapons officer painted the landscape with 30 cannon fire. But she'd never known their names. In combat, they were just grid coordinates and radio call signs, precious cargo that needed to get home alive. He doesn't know, Hawkins said, reading her expression. None of them know the name of the pilot who saved their lives that night. The mission reports were classified, the aircraft logs were sealed, and your commanding officer was transferred before the paperwork could be processed properly. The general closed the folder and tucked it back inside her jacket. But I know, I've known for 5 years, and I've been waiting for the right moment to make this right. Kalina opened her eyes, studying the woman across from her with new understanding. Ma'am, I didn't do anything special that night. I did my job. Your job? Hawkins shook her head. Chief, your job was to provide air support. What you did was perform miracles under impossible conditions. There's a difference. The sound of aircraft engines rumbled overhead as the morning flight operations began. F-16s launching for patrol, transport helicopters ferrying supplies and personnel, the rhythmic thump of rotor blades that formed the heartbeat of forward operating bases around the world. But in the hangar, surrounded by the scent of paint and fuel and possibility, the 2 women existed in a pocket of stillness. What do you want from me, General? Kalina asked finally. Hawkins smiled, and for the first time it reached her eyes. I want you to stop hiding, Chief. I want you to remember that heroes don't get to choose whether they're heroes. They just get to choose what they do with the responsibility. She gestured toward the painted-over Callsign on the Apache's nose. Viper isn't just a name you earned in combat. It's a name that means something to every pilot who's ever flown with you, every soldier who's called for air support and heard your voice on the radio, every family member who got to hug their loved one because you brought them home alive. Kalina ran her hand along the aircraft's hull, feeling the texture of fresh paint over old scars. The Army doesn't need heroes, ma'am. It needs pilots who can fly their missions and come home in one piece. The Army needs both, Hawkins replied. But right now, in this moment, I need Viper. The words carried weight that went beyond rank and protocol. This wasn't a general speaking to a chief warrant officer. This was one warrior recognizing another, acknowledging shared understanding of what it meant to carry impossible burdens with quiet dignity. There's a situation developing, Hawkins continued, her tone shifting to match the gravity of her words. We have assets in trouble, time running out, and weather conditions that have grounded every other pilot on this base. Kalina felt her pulse quicken despite her efforts to remain calm. Ma'am. Reconnaissance team went dark 12 hours ago, deep in Taliban territory. Last communication indicated they were being hunted. We need immediate extraction, and the window is closing fast. The general paused, letting the implications settle. Every pilot we've consulted says it's suicide. Mountain terrain, zero visibility, hostile forces, and a storm system that's turning the whole region into a flying graveyard. Kalina nodded slowly, understanding dawning. And you think Viper might have a different opinion? I think, Hawkins said carefully, that some missions require a pilot who's already proven they can do impossible things. I think some situations call for someone who's made a career out of bringing people home when everyone else says it can't be done. The weight of decision pressed down on Kalina like altitude sickness. She'd spent years trying to fade into the background, to be just another warrant officer maintaining aircraft and flying routine missions. But the sky had other plans, and duty had a way of finding pilots who tried to hide from their own legends. "What's the timeline?" she asked. Hawkins checked her watch. "Birds in the air in 2 hours. Mission parameters are classified, but I can tell you that if these soldiers don't come home, their families will never know what happened to them." Kalina understood the subtext. Black operations, deniable assets, the kind of missions that existed in the shadows between official policy and operational necessity. The kind of work that required pilots who could fly into hell and navigate back by feel and instinct alone. She looked at her Apache, hull gleaming with fresh paint that couldn't quite hide the aircraft's history. Like her, it had seen too much combat, absorbed too much damage, carried too many secrets. But also like her, it was still capable of extraordinary things when the situation demanded it. "I'll need my regular co-pilot," she said finally. "Chief Warrant Officer Reyes is already being briefed. And full autonomy over flight planning and tactical decisions. Already approved." Kalina smiled for the first time since the conversation began. "You were pretty confident I'd say yes." General Hawkins returned the smile. "Chief, I've been reading your service record for 5 years. I know exactly who you are and what you're capable of. The only question was whether you'd remember it too." She turned to leave, then paused. "One more thing, Viper. This mission. It's not just about bringing those soldiers home. It's about reminding everyone why some names become legends. Your legend isn't finished yet." As the general's footsteps echoed away across the concrete, Kalina stood alone with her Apache and the weight of destiny pressing down around her. The morning sun had climbed higher, streaming through the hangar's high windows and illuminating dust motes that danced like possibilities in the air. She picked up her paintbrush and dipped it in the black paint, then set it aside without touching the aircraft's hull. Some callsigns, she realized, weren't meant to stay hidden. Some names carried too much history, too much meaning, too much responsibility to cover up with routine maintenance and quiet service. Viper was about to fly again. The briefing room buzzed with nervous energy as Kalina entered, her flight suit freshly pressed and her helmet tucked under her arm. The assembled personnel, intelligence officers, logistics coordinators, communications specialists, looked up with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed skepticism. She was used to it by now. The moment when people realized their extraction pilot was a woman who looked like she should be teaching high school mathematics rather than flying combat missions into hostile territory. Chief Warrant Officer Diego Reyes was already seated at the front table, studying satellite imagery with the focused intensity that had made him one of the most requested co-pilots in the theater. He glanced up as she approached, offering a slight nod that conveyed both greeting and reassurance. They'd flown together for 18 months, long enough to develop the kind of wordless communication that kept crews alive when everything went sideways. "Ladies and gentlemen," announced Major Collins, the mission commander, "meet your extraction pilot, Chief Warrant Officer Thorne." The room's energy shifted subtly, conversations pausing as eyes assessed and measured. Kalina had experienced this moment hundreds of times, the instant when soldiers decided whether they trusted their lives to her hands. She'd learned long ago that respect wasn't given freely. It was earned one mission at a time, one safe landing at a time, one impossible flight at a time. "Callsign Viper," Collins continued, and something in his tone suggested he knew exactly what that name meant. The skeptical expressions around the room began to change. Whispers started in the back rows, soldiers leaning toward each other with sudden recognition. Viper wasn't just a call sign. It was a ghost story told in ready rooms and mess halls, a legend that had grown in the telling until some people wondered if she even existed. Sergeant First Class Murphy, a grizzled communications specialist with 3 deployments under his belt, leaned forward in his chair. "Ma'am, are you the same Viper who pulled that Ranger unit out of Mosul in '08? Kalina met his gaze steadily. I've pulled a lot of people out of a lot of places, Sergeant. The names don't matter as much as getting home safe. But Murphy wasn't satisfied. 12 Rangers, completely surrounded, LZ hot as hell, and you came in during a rocket attack. Landed long enough to load casualties and took off with your tail rotor shot to pieces. The room had gone completely quiet now, all attention focused on the exchange. Kalina could feel the weight of their expectations settling around her like armor. Like I said, she replied calmly, we got home safe. Major Collins cleared his throat, redirecting attention to the mission at hand. Right now, we have 4 soldiers who need to get home safe. Reconnaissance Team Alpha went dark at 300 hours, approximately 30 clicks northeast of here. He activated the wall display, showing satellite imagery of mountain terrain that looked like a moonscape designed by someone with a grudge against aircraft. Last known position puts them in a valley system with minimal landing opportunities, hostile forces in the area, and weather conditions that are getting worse by the hour. The meteorology officer, a young lieutenant who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, stepped forward with a tablet full of bad news. Current conditions show cloud ceiling at 300 feet and dropping, winds gusting to 40 knots, and visibility less than half a mile. Storm system is intensifying and isn't expected to clear for at least 18 hours. Around the room, pilots shook their heads. These weren't conditions for flying. They were conditions for writing letters to next of kin. What about alternative extraction methods? Asked Captain Williams, a Black Hawk pilot with enough flight hours to know suicide when he saw it. Collins' expression remained neutral, but his answer carried finality. Ground forces are 12 hours out minimum, and we don't have 12 hours. Satellite intel suggests hostile forces are actively hunting our people. He clicked to the next slide, showing thermal imagery taken 6 hours earlier. These heat signatures indicate at least 24 fighters moving through the area with vehicles and heavy weapons. Our reconnaissance team is trained for evasion, but they're outnumbered and running out of places to hide. The tactical picture was becoming clearer, and none of it was good. 4 soldiers trapped in a valley that looked like nature's own aircraft carrier trap, hunted by an enemy force that had home field advantage and superior numbers, all while a storm system turned the mountains into a flying nightmare. "Sir," said Captain Rodriguez, another Apache pilot with a reputation for aggressive tactics, "this sounds like a job for close air support, not extraction. Send in the A-10s, clear the area, then worry about pickup." Collins shook his head. "Warthogs are grounded due to weather, and by the time conditions clear, it'll be too late. This is a stealth operation. Get in, get our people, get out." Diego Reyes had been studying the terrain maps with the intensity of a monk reading scripture. Finally, he looked up and asked the question everyone was thinking, but nobody wanted to voice. "Sir, what makes you think this is even possible?" The room held its collective breath. Mission commanders didn't like having their planning questioned, especially not in front of a room full of personnel who were already nervous about flying into conditions that violated several laws of physics and common sense. But Collins just smiled. "What makes me think it's possible is sitting right there in the front row." All eyes turned to Kalina, who had been quietly studying the same terrain maps with the focused attention of someone planning a route through hell. She looked up, aware that every person in that room was measuring her against their own fear and uncertainty. "The valley system has 3 potential approach routes," she said, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had navigated impossible situations before. 2 of them are death traps, narrow passes with vertical walls that would turn us into a clay pigeon for anyone with a rifle. She stood and walked to the display, pointing at specific features in the satellite imagery. "But this third route, along the Eastern Ridge Line, offers possibilities. It's not going to be comfortable, and it's definitely not going to be by the book flying, but it might work." Captain Rodriguez frowned at the image. "Ma'am, that's not a flight path, that's a hiking trail." Kalina's smile was sharp as her call sign. "Captain, I've been flying contour routes through mountain terrain since before GPS was reliable. Sometimes the difference between a flight path and a hiking trail is just altitude and attitude." She traced the route with her finger, explaining approach angles and terrain masking techniques that most pilots had only read about in theoretical manuals. This wasn't textbook flying. This was combat aviation reduced to its purest form: pilot, aircraft, and the absolute refusal to leave people behind. "Weather's going to be our biggest challenge," she continued. "But it works both ways. If we can't see the ground can't see us. And if we stay low enough, we'll be under their radar coverage." The meteorology lieutenant raised a trembling hand. "Ma'am, flying in zero visibility conditions with terrain like that is dangerous," Kalina finished. "So is leaving American soldiers to die in a foreign country because we were too scared to try bringing them home." The room fell silent again, but this time the quiet carried weight instead of uncertainty. These were all soldiers who understood the mathematics of military service, that sometimes the equation balanced lives saved against lives risked, and sometimes the answer required more courage than calculations. Major Collins nodded approvingly. "Questions about the mission parameters?" Sergeant Murphy raised his hand again. "Ma'am, what do you need from us?" Kalina looked around the room, meeting eyes and measuring the determination she saw there. "I need you to do your jobs the same way you'd want someone to do theirs if your sons or daughters were trapped in that valley. I need communications that don't fail, logistics that don't break down, and intelligence that keeps us one step ahead of the people trying to kill us." She paused, letting the words settle. "But mostly, I need you to trust that Diego and I know what we're doing, even when it looks like we don't." The briefing continued for another hour, covering contingency plans and emergency protocols and backup systems for backup systems. But the real decision had already been made in those first few minutes, when a room full of skeptical soldiers realized they were looking at someone who had turned impossible missions into routine flights so many times that she'd forgotten to be impressed with herself. As the personnel filed out to begin pre-flight preparations, Diego approached with the kind of expression that usually preceded difficult conversations. "Cal," he said quietly, "this one's different. I can feel it." She nodded, understanding what he meant. Every mission carried risks, but some missions carried destinies. This felt like the latter. "You want to call in sick?" she asked with a slight smile. Diego laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Right. Missed the flight where Viper comes out of retirement. I'd rather face the Taliban." He gathered his charts and navigation aids, then paused at the door. "For what it's worth, I'm glad they're not sending someone else. If those soldiers are coming home, they're coming home with us." Alone in the briefing room, Kalina stared at the satellite imagery that showed the valley where 4 Americans were hiding from death and hopping for rescue. The mountains looked like broken teeth in the grainy photographs, all sharp edges and shadows that could hide entire armies or conceal the wreckage of aircraft that had tried to fly where physics suggested they shouldn't. She'd flown into similar terrain dozens of times, navigating by instinct and experience through conditions that would have challenged eagles. But each mission had been unique, presenting its own collection of variables and unknowns that couldn't be solved with training manuals or computer simulations. This mission felt different because it was different. General Hawkins had been right about heroes not getting to choose their moments. Sometimes the moment chose you, arriving with the weight of history and the expectation that you would rise to meet whatever impossibility the universe had decided to test you with. Kalina folded her charts and headed for the door, already mentally rehearsing the flight path that would either bring 4 soldiers home or add 5 more names to the casualty reports. Either way, Viper was going flying. The pre-flight inspection took on ritual significance in the gray pre-dawn light filtering through the hangar doors. Kalina moved around her Apache with methodical precision, checking control surfaces and weapons systems with the focused attention of someone who understood that mechanical failure at altitude could transform rescue missions into memorial services. The aircraft crouched like a predatory insect, all angles and weaponry, and barely contained violence. Diego was already strapped into the co-pilot seat, running through systems checks with the systematic thoroughness that had kept them alive through 18 months of combat operations. His voice carried clearly through the intercom, calling out readings and confirmations in the clipped professional tone that meant business. Flight controls check good, weapons systems online, navigation suite showing green across the board. Roger that, Kalina replied, settling into the pilot's seat and feeling the familiar embrace of straps and switches that had become as comfortable as home. Engine start sequence initiated. The Apache's twin turboshaft engines wound up with the distinctive whine that announced serious intent to anyone within miles. The aircraft shivered with barely restrained power, eager to leave the ground and find its natural element in the hostile sky above Afghanistan's moonscape terrain. General Hawkins appeared at the hangar entrance, flanked by the same group of junior officers who had been taking notes earlier. But now their tablets were forgotten, replaced by the universal military expression of people watching warriors prepare for battle. The general raised her hand in a salute that carried more weight than protocol required. Kalina returned the salute through the cockpit window, understanding the exchange for what it was: acknowledgement between professionals who had both stared into darkness and chosen to keep flying toward the light. Tower, this is Viper 1, requesting immediate departure clearance. Viper 1, Tower. You are cleared for immediate departure. Winds are 270 at 35 gusting to 45. Visibility less than half a mile and deteriorating. The weather report confirmed what Kalina could see through the windscreen: a gray ceiling that looked solid enough to walk on, pressing down toward the earth with the weight of accumulated moisture and bad intentions. Normal pilots would look at conditions like these and find creative reasons to postpone until visibility improved. But Viper had never been accused of being normal. Tower Viper 1 copies all, going tactical frequency, see you for breakfast. The Apache lifted off with the controlled aggression of a hunting raptor, transitioning immediately to forward flight and disappearing into the gray wall that separated Earth from sky. Within seconds, the base had vanished below them, swallowed by clouds that turned the world into an abstract study in gray and uncertainty. Switching to terrain following radar, Diego announced, his instruments glowing green in the darkened cockpit. We're officially flying blind. Kalina adjusted their heading slightly, feeling the aircraft respond to her touch like a living thing. Flying in zero visibility was part technical skill and part mystical communion with forces that couldn't be measured on instruments. It required absolute trust in training, equipment, and the accumulated experience of thousands of flight hours spent learning to read messages written in vibration and sound, and the subtle weight shifts that told stories about wind and weather, and the proximity of very large, very solid objects. Contact bearing 090, 12 kilometers, Diego reported, monitoring his threat detection systems. Single vehicle stationary. Acknowledged, probably a checkpoint or observation post. They flew on through gray nothing, navigating by coordinates and intuition toward a valley that existed somewhere beyond the weather. The Apache's engines maintained their steady drone, pushing them forward through air that felt thick as soup and twice as opaque. You know, Diego said conversationally, normal people would call this insane. Good thing we're not normal people. The terrain below was invisible but not absent. A constant presence felt rather than seen, waiting to remind careless pilots that gravity remained undefeated in aerial combat. Kalina flew by feel and radar, trusting instruments that painted electronic pictures of mountains and valleys in harsh green lines on her displays. Viper 1, this is Havoc Base. Radio check. Havoc Base, Viper 1. Signal strength 5 by 5. Viper 1, be advised we're showing multiple contacts moving in your area of operations. Recommend extreme caution. Kalina smiled grimly. Extreme caution had stopped being an option the moment they agreed to fly into a storm system that had grounded every other aircraft on the base. Now they were operating in the realm where caution got replaced by controlled aggression and the absolute refusal to quit. Havoc Base, Viper 1 copies. We'll keep our eyes open. Diego chuckled despite the circumstances. Eyes open, right, because visibility is our biggest advantage right now. The Apache continued its ghost flight through gray emptiness. 2 aviators and $30 million worth of military technology committed to a mission that existed somewhere between courage and madness. Behind them, the forward operating base had vanished as completely as if it had never existed. Ahead lay mountains, enemies, weather, and 4 American soldiers whose survival depended on finding miracles in places where miracles were usually in short supply. But Viper had been finding miracles for most of her career, pulling them out of thin air and impossible circumstances with the kind of stubborn determination that refused to acknowledge when situations were hopeless. Today would either add another chapter to that legend or close the book entirely. Either way, they kept flying forward into the gray unknown, where heroes were made one decision at a time, and legends were written in vapor trails that disappeared almost before they formed. 20 minutes into the flight, the mountains began making their presence known through subtle changes in air pressure and the way sound behaved in the cockpit. Diego's instruments painted electronic portraits of peaks and ridgelines that rose like sleeping giants through the storm, their slopes steep enough to challenge mountain goats, and definitely steep enough to ruin the day of any pilot who got too intimate with the terrain. Contact bearing 045 8 kilometers, Diego announced, his voice carrying new tension. Multiple vehicles moving fast. Kalina adjusted course slightly, steering away from whatever was racing through the valley below. The mission parameters were clear: stealth over engagement, extraction over heroics. Getting into a firefight would accomplish nothing except alerting every hostile force in the province that American aircraft were operating in the area. Enemy composition. Looks like 3 vehicles, probably technical trucks. They're hauling ass toward something. The implications settled over both pilots like cold rain. If the enemy was moving with purpose and speed, it usually meant they'd found something worth chasing, or someone worth hunting. Time to target area. Diego consulted his navigation display. 15 minutes at current speed and heading. The Apache pressed on through gray emptiness, racing against time and weather, and the possibility that their rescue mission was about to become a recovery operation. Below them, invisible but malevolent, the mountains waited with the patience of geological time and the appetite of avalanches. Viper 1, this is Recon Alpha. The transmission crackled with static and desperation, barely audible over the storm interference. Kalina felt her heart rate spike. It was the first communication from the missing team in 12 hours. Recon Alpha, this is Viper 1. We're inbound to your location. What's your status? Viper 1, we're compromised and taking fire. Multiple hostiles closing on our position. We need immediate extraction. The professional calm in the voice was undercut by the sound of gunfire and shouting in the background. These were special operations soldiers, trained to maintain composure under impossible circumstances, but even they couldn't completely hide the stress of being hunted through hostile territory by an enemy force that outnumbered them 6-1. Recon Alpha, can you mark your position? Negative on marking. Too much enemy activity. We're in the Eastern Valley system, approximately 2 clicks north of primary LZ. Kalina processed the information quickly. The Eastern Valley was the most defensible position for the ground team, but also the most challenging for aircraft operations. Steep walls, limited maneuvering room, and nowhere to run if things went bad. Recon Alpha, we're 8 minutes out. Can you hold position? A pause, filled with the distinctive crack of rifle fire and the deeper roar of something that sounded like a heavy machine gun. Viper 1, we'll hold as long as we can, but you better hurry. The transmission ended, leaving them alone again in the gray void between earth and sky. But now the emptiness felt different, charged with urgency, and the knowledge that 4 American soldiers were running out of time, ammunition, and hiding places. Contact! Diego's voice cut through the cockpit noise with knife-edge intensity. Multiple signatures, bearing 080, 6 kilometers. They're converging on the valley system. Kalina pushed the Apache faster, trading fuel efficiency for speed and hopping. They weren't already too late. The aircraft responded eagerly, as if it too understood that this flight was different from routine patrols and training missions. Weapon systems armed and ready, Diego reported, just in case. Let's hope it doesn't come to that. But even as she said it, Kalina knew they were flying toward the kind of situation where hope got measured in ammunition counts and extraction windows measured in heartbeats. The mountains ahead held secrets written in gunfire and desperation, and Viper was about to fly directly into the middle of a story that was still being written in blood and courage, and the absolute refusal to leave people behind. The storm pressed closer around them, as if the weather itself was trying to prevent them from reaching their destination. But storms had tried to stop Viper before, and physics had learned not to bet against her when American lives hung in the balance. They flew on toward the mountains, toward the sound of guns, toward whatever waited in the valley where heroes were about to be tested against impossible odds. The Eastern Valley revealed itself gradually through the storm, emerging from gray,